Got it right at last. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second or third meeting of Scrutiny in January of this year. There's a bit of echo going on, but I'm not sure why that's the case. Still, we'll work it out. Welcome to the Scrutiny meeting. First, I've got to remind everybody of the domestic arrangements. Toilets are situated outside the meeting room. Cold water is available in the breakout area, also outside the meeting room. If the fire alarm should sound, please leave the meeting room by following the fire exit signs and meeting on the Ipswich Town Football Club training pitch. Please do not use the atrium stairs to exit the building and do not re-enter the building until you are told it is safe to do so. Please switch off all mobile phones or turn them to silent. I'd like to remind everybody that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. The whole of the meeting will be filmed, except where there are confidential or exempt items. If you make a representation to the meeting, well, it doesn't look like that's going to happen today, but you will be deemed by the council to have consented to being filmed. By entering this room, you're also consenting to being filmed by the council and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and/or training purposes. So we come to the first item on the agenda, which is apologies and substitutes.
Good morning. We have received apologies from Councillor Grandin.
Okay, the second item on the agenda is declarations of interests. Do I have any, or do we have any declarations of interests? I'll take that as a no then, and that's definitely much about as they should be. Item 4 rather, receive notifications of petitions in accordance with the Council's petition scheme.
None received.
And item 4 is questions by the public.
None received.
And item 5 is questions by councillors.
None received, Chair.
So we come to the first paper, and the first substantive item, item 6 on the agenda, is BOS 19/5, which is the draft general budget for 2020-21 and the 4-year outlook for that year and the succeeding 3. So I'll ask Councillor John Ward, as the Cabinet Member for Finance, to introduce the paper before handing on to officers.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to introduce report BOS 19/5 for the 2020 to 2021 General Fund budget and the 4-year outlook. The report contains details of the draft revenue and capital budgets and the Council's strategic financial aim. Now, we do have a sound financial strategy that does respond effectively to the changing funding landscape for local government. The strategic aims, principles and approach are set out in section 6 of the report. But in summary, we must continue with our efforts to become self-sufficient through maximising our income streams, continue to make efficiencies and productivity savings, and continue to find new ways of working. Just by way of a bit of an introduction, the government has confirmed the fair funding review and the business rates review and the business rates reset have all been deferred by 12 months to 2021 to 2022. However, we do have a recently announced provisional financial settlement for the forthcoming year, which does give us an additional funding of £265,000. Details of this are provided in section 4.14 of the report. Now, I did mention the 4-year outlook. The general fund budget setting is just a part of producing a medium-term outlook for our finances, which is both sensible and sustainable. And so there has been a lot of time spent on projecting the 4-year outlook, and the details of the funding pressures and savings in income for the next 4 years are provided in sections 8.2 to 8.18. Core to the funding is the need to have a strong council tax base, and therefore from the perspective of the 4-year outlook, the numbers do produce a compelling case for the need for council tax increases each year. And so for 2020 to 2021, we will do this at the maximum level allowed without requiring a referendum, i.e. £5 per year for an average Band E property, and this equates to 3.1%. We will be reducing this to 2% thereafter. But along with the most welcome 2.51% growth in the Band E equivalent number of properties for the past year, and 1.5% per annum thereafter, this will ensure we can grow our council tax revenues to help offset the ongoing cost pressures we face. And together these will provide £308,000 of additional income for 2020 to 2021. Now, since 2011 to 2012, the Council has achieved cumulative savings in income of £17.4 million through shared services, efficiencies, better use of technology and maximising commercial opportunities, thereby vindicating the bold decisions that have been made in that period. Further savings in income of £2.6 million have already been identified for next year and beyond, and the details of these are provided in section 8.18. The General Fund budget requires £512,000 of the 2020 to 2021 New Homes bonus receipts, £1.2 million of Section 31 grants, £227,000 of Rural Service Delivery Grant, and £304,000 from our earmarked reserves in order to achieve a balanced budget. It should be noted here that £304,000 from reserves is only half the amount we transferred last year. And the good news is that only 49% of the anticipated New Homes bonus will be required, which will enable us to transfer the rest to the Transformation Fund. And the details of the New Homes bonus funding are provided in sections 8.6 to 8.10 of the report. The overall budget gap for this period is described in sections 8.19 to 8.22, and in your report in front of you amounts to cumulative £1.32 million. And significant income or savings, or both, will be needed to address this. The good news, however, is that we are predicting a budget surplus of £542,000, which is the unused New Homes bonus that will go to the Transformation Fund. Now, I do have a bit of an update actually on those numbers, and that £542,000 surplus has increased now to £584,000, and the cumulative number has the cumulative number is now £1.125 million as opposed to £1.32 million. So those are hot off the press updates. Okay. Right. The reserve levels are detailed in paragraph 7.5, table 3. And while we had to use a large amount for the 2019 to 2020 budget, thanks to the New Homes bonus contribution, the level at the end of March 2021 is expected to improve, with the Transformation Fund a much healthier, well, your number there is £848,000, but it'll be nearer to £900,000 as a result of the increase in the surplus this year. But even with this improvement, the level of reserves, excluding SIL, drops by 10% over the 2 years from March 2019 to March 2021, and this does require close attention in the future. The capital programme is set out in Appendix B, and the planned spend for 2020 to 2021 is £12.1 million, but again, there are some changes to that.
We're on Appendix B?
Appendix, yeah. So that change now is the capital programme has reduced to £11.5 million for the forthcoming year. Right. The main area is just under £1 million on housing grants, £8.7 million investment in SIFCO, and just under £1 million on the continuation of the refurbishment of the 2 leisure centres. The 3 major differences from this time last year are that we're not expecting to complete the further SIFCO investment until 2021 to 2022 now. The Bellevue capital investment has been delayed until 2021 to 2022, and we have yet to dip into the strategic land and property investment fund. The capital and investment strategy will have further details of the Council's borrowing capacity and the impacts of the capital programme, and this will be presented to Cabinet in February along with the final budget report following review by the Joint Audit and Standards Committee. Finally, we'll be making changes to the empty property discount. The background to this is explained in sections 11.1 to 11.7, and we will keep the level of discount for unoccupied and unfurnished properties at 25%, but reduce the period from 3 months to 28 days, after which full council tax is payable. The uninhabitable discount will remain unchanged at 25% for 12 months. If this had been in place in 2018, we would have raised a further £53,000 in council tax. So that gives you some context of the amount of money involved there. And so that concludes my report.
Right. I don't know if any officers want to add anything to that, or if there's any points that they think need to be brought forward from members of the committee. No? Shakes of heads all round. So then, members, it's over to us to raise any questions we have regarding this paper and regarding the appendices or any other part. Now, it strikes me that a possible approach we could take here is looking at the report and the structure of it. We have initially a statement of what the current financial situation is, what arrangements have been made from central government, the external pressures, if you like. That includes changes to the new homes bonus. And from that and our own internal finances, our own cost pressures, then lead us, presumably, I think inexorably, to the decisions that have been made, which are listed in the recommendation. Those being the council tax rise, the changes to discounts, and just some other variation things. So are there any of those points that you'd like to bring up and ask questions on? Well, please don't all rush at once. Okay. I wonder, the first thing I'd noted about the budget paper as a whole, I mean, particularly the general fund budget, that this seemed a great deal simpler in design and construction as a paper than perhaps we'd seen in previous years. I don't know if that's necessarily a question, but I wonder if you could comment on that, Catherine.
The content and style for this year is similar to last year, but we did make a conscious effort last year to change the structure. Melissa and the team did put a lot of effort into that with feedback that we'd had to try and make it easier to read, should I say. So yes, that was a conscious decision.
Well, I can recall in the past great wadges of paper having been presented to us, most of which made very little sense. This, by comparison, makes a great deal more. I think there's a couple of things that need to be brought out in the meeting, though, and I think they need to be better understood by councillors and members of the public. Mary.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this business about the the press release on the increase in the council tax, which I thought I understood, and then went to my parish council meetings and realised that nobody understood it. And I've had to do some homework as a result of that. So I think that when press releases are made to the public, I think it has to be a bit simpler and explain in context. So what they read was that Babergh District Council were putting £5 per annum, and people assumed it was on the total amount, rather than the amount that actually Babergh District Council... Rather
than band D... Oh, yes, I see what you're saying.
No,
yeah, they'd assumed it was the whole council tax.
So we had a discussion about what was 3%, and £5 certainly wasn't 3% of a band D, which might be 1,800.
Councillor Ward.
Yeah, this is a perennial problem, unfortunately, because we are the collecting authority. We collect on behalf of the county, the Police and Crime Commissioner, and also we collect the parish precepts as well. We do try to stress each time that we are talking purely about the Babergh proportion. So that £5 puts up the average band D property to £168.86 per annum, and that is a 3% rise on that Babergh proportion. And we do try to stress this all the time, but unfortunately, because as the collecting authority, we collect all these other elements and all they see is a total, although there is a breakdown on their council tax bills, which does show what is Babergh, what is Suffolk, etc. We do have to explain this each year, unfortunately. It's one of those things where we do our best, but it's going to keep cropping up.
Councillor McLaren.
Thank you. Is it possible, though, for some example to be given? I don't know how you do that, but some example, because once you look at the training we had, Catherine, on the division, you understand it, but the public don't get that sort of explanation. And of course, what is a surprise is that the district council amount is quite small in comparison to everybody else that has a piece of the action. So I think that would come as a surprise to the public.
There's a figure I do every year, I must admit myself, I've been doing this for the last few years, a breakdown in percentage terms, but I've actually managed to reduce it to this is again as an approximation as of last year, and I don't see there being a massive difference between last year across all the various authorities and this one. But roughly speaking, it's about £24 a week on a Band D property. This is the average size property. In fact, it's actually slightly above the average size property, but it's £24 a week is your payment to Suffolk County Council. I think it works out at £4 a week to the Police and Crime Commissioner, £3 a week to the District Council, that is to say us, and roughly £1 or even less a week to your parish precept. So that's 1, 3, 4, 24. 3/4 of the council tax total is actually for Suffolk County Council, and that percentage, it may be in fact be 74%, but I believe those are fairly accurate figures, and that's a rule of thumb: 1, 3, 4, 24. And that's something I've used for some time, and I think it makes it a sort of understandable amount, and that's per week. Okay, so it's multiplied by 52, and you have the annual figure more or less. Councillor Ward.
I'll see what we can do in terms of providing more clarity to residents when their bills go out. It's, as I say, it's something we have to struggle with every year. But you're right, that on those numbers, with Babergh being just over £3 a week, it's incredibly good value for money. We do so much for that. I know it's a bit of a propaganda exercise, this, but I mean, even if all we did was to empty the bins, it would be good value for money, but we do everything else as well on top of that as the planning authority, in terms of provision of leisure facilities, the licensing authority. I could go on, but we'll see what we can do in terms of providing more clarity to residents, definitely.
Councillor McLaren?
Could I ask whether there is any, we have, at the May election, we had a change of parish councillors, and I think that perhaps has led to some, not everybody understands the concept. Is there training for parish councillors around sort of?
So we don't do training for all the parish councillors. Obviously, we've got 200 across the 2 districts. But what we are doing is the next parish and town council briefing, early February. I'm going along to do a budget slot. So those who come along to that briefing, then they'll get some headline information about our budget position.
Speaking as a parish councillor of some years, SALC, the Suffolk Association of Local Councils, does in fact provide councillor training and can provide targeted training. I think a lot of it, I mean, I've found in my own experience, but particularly since becoming a district councillor as well, the insight of the two. I noticed that we have Councillor Osborne with us here today, another Councillor Osborne, and you'd like to say something there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On that subject, perhaps we could ask the chairman of the SALC group, Councillor Adrian Osborne, to raise that they could bring that training forward as a priority. Perhaps it's a bit late for this particular budget, but for future budgets, that would be a good idea.
Thank you very much, Councillor Osborne, for reminding me that the other Councillor Osborne is in fact the chairman of SALC for us. So, Adrian, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Osborne. Yes, SALC will identify any issues that parishes and towns have, and there is training available. There's quite a long list of stuff that they will train on. So, yes, parishes and towns will be able to use SALC as a training tool for that. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to ask Catherine or John the position with the precepts as we go on. I've found that we've had a lot from our town council about the arrangements for the budget and how the budget then actually holds back parish and towns' arrangements for their precept. Is there any way that, obviously it's all, and I very much respect what you've done over the years and your finance officers, is there any other way that a little bit further, what's the word for it? To be able to bring forward some of the precepts from Babergh so that the town and parishes will be able to know what their precept has got to be when they do their bring their finance forward to you.
So is this a question of when the tax base figures are released and people can start the calculations for their own parish council budgets? Is that what we're talking about?
That's correct.
So it's parish and town council budgets that we're looking at and how we can relate those to the Babergh budget.
Mr. Chairman, the problem is it does make the time gap between these things quite tight for towns and parishes.
Yes, I understand the point you're making. I was just checking what our dependencies are in terms of when we can do those calculations. And we do have to do what's called a council tax base return in October each year, and it's after that that we can then do the individual parish and town council tax base calculations. So I know we usually get them out in November. I'm not sure if that's the start or the end, but we obviously do have to submit that October return first before we can then go on. So I think we probably would struggle to bring it forward a huge amount. We'll have a look, see if we can shave in a week or two off it, but I think in terms of trying to bring it forward a month or two, I don't think we've got that opportunity because of the government return that we have to do.
Yeah, Councillor Osborne.
Thank you for that, Catherine. I mean, the obvious situation there is that when you've got full councils at parish and towns, obviously that comes up, but they cannot go a lot forward on some of those issues because we don't know what Babergh's situation is with their budget. But I quite understand that. And I would just like to add that Councillor McLaren's comments about more of an output for residents to know exactly where they stand with their thing. I think if you attend to that, it would be fantastic. Thank you.
Just a note to an observation in passing that this is actually something we may be referring to, coming back to in a later item on today's agenda, which is to look at our forward plan. That may address some of your points in passing. I just mentioned that. I had a specific query which had been bothering me because it's just a significant part of not so much this year's budget. This year's budget actually does quite nicely out of this factor, and it's changes in the arrangements for the New Homes Bonus. Now, the New Homes Bonus obviously has been in existence for many years now. I forget, is it 2010 it started? That would be about right. I think there was a general election that year. And we've had it sort of since, and it's steadily risen, built up to a maximum of 2016, 2017 in terms of how many years it lasted, and then the number of years has progressively been reduced, and now it's disappearing effectively. And I just wondered if the context of that, some explanation of what the national context is for New Homes Bonus and what might replace it, because if it doesn't affect this year's budget, according to these figures, it will affect us for the next 4 years.
Yeah, as I say, there is a bit of a void at the moment in terms of what might replace it. I think we've had the clearest signal from the government now that New Homes Bonus is going. They have said there will be a housing incentive, but that's all we've had so far. They've made a comment that it's more likely to be linked to planning. I know in the past they have thought about reducing the amount of New Homes Bonus that got paid if you were allowing planning permissions on appeal rather than at the first time. So whether they're thinking of something along those lines, but again, I don't know how much money nationally they might put towards New Homes Bonus, because 2021 is the last year of the current comprehensive spending review. We don't have any national totals beyond that. So,
just to put that into perspective, the current housing incentive, the New Homes Bonus, is based upon completion of those houses. Do you think they're thinking of it actually being done on the granting of permission? And how would that be paid for? Or is this is all very hypothetical, I do appreciate, but it's still worth asking.
I don't know at the moment. As I say, we're waiting. The provisional settlement said that they would consult on their proposals for what will replace New Homes Bonus. So I don't know what that's going to be. At the end of last week, I did submit our response to the provisional settlement consultation and the questions they were asking, and in that I did just urge them to consult quickly on that rather than leaving it a long time. Then that gives us longer to plan ahead.
Councillor Ward?
Make sure that the committee members can be assured that the District Council's network is lobbying very hard for the continuation of some sort of housing delivery incentive. New Homes Bonus is a key part of central funding now for councils, and we're losing a lot of other sources of funding, so all councils do need this in one form or another. We do understand that it has to be linked to delivery of housing, so there is some strong lobbying from the DCN to ensure that there is, going forward, a proper incentivised funding mechanism in place.
And I would guess the Local Government Association will also be involved. Yes, sorry, Catherine.
So just to add something to that, the current New Homes Bonus does get split between the two tiers of local authority. So we get 80% of the current sums of money, and the County Council get 20%. The LGA obviously represents both tiers of local authorities, and whether the government may do something between the tiers, obviously the pressures are all being around social care, so adults and children as well. So if the government makes changes, they might actually change how the allocations are done between the different tiers of authorities as well. So that may go against us.
Yes, and similarly with any change to business rates, if there is an increase to the 75% business rates retention, there will undoubtedly be some sort of bun fight between counties and districts over the apportioning there. But there's a lot to be discussed and a lot to be lobbied for. I may hear some more at the DCN annual conference next month, but I think that might be a bit too soon.
I think this is probably, it's fair to say, one of the more difficult years since we have a change of at least style of government in some ways, and clearly there are different ideas going to be applying. Of course, I don't think we've ever had such a febrile political situation for very many years. The only thing I think we haven't addressed as yet, and I think it needs to be, is whenever increases are being talked about or changes, the changes to the discounts that were discussed and are inherent in the budget. Now, I appreciate you said if we'd been charging these, we would have gained something like £58,000 this year. But I just wondered if you could give some rationale to the reasons behind the decisions for the changes in the unoccupied and unfurnished discounts.
Well, we want to encourage properties to come back into use, essentially. And if something is unoccupied and unfurnished but habitable, we don't want to provide continuing incentives to leave it like that. We want to be able to ensure that the properties are brought back into use. We have a housing shortage. We want to see as few unoccupied properties as possible.
Well, that was succinct. Thanks very much. Okay. Probably rather more succinct than the question. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you.
Did that for me too.
Yeah. Sorry, obviously, I'm probably asking a question that you already know, but what is the check on, I mean, how often does the council connect with these people that own these properties? Is there a regular update on the situation or the status of an unoccupied property?
I think we actually have the opportunity to answer this from two particular sections, one from the officers that's present here and also from Councillor Osborne, who's the Cabinet Member for Housing. I think both sides can explain how the housing team deals with those situations. Who would like first crack at this one? Gavin, welcome to this.
Thank you, Chair.
Nice question.
Just in answer to the question, a report is issued to the private sector housing team on a reasonably regular basis, and they review properties that are either going onto that empty homes list or coming off it, and obviously they use that as the list of properties that they then target through grants and loans to support some of those homes coming back into use if the owners need assistance.
Councillor McLaren.
Gavin again. Is that a sort of face-to-face, or is it sort of by email or enforcement? Or
so the private sector housing team is currently only made up of 3 private sector housing officers. There's a current review of that service going on at the moment. So typically correspondence would initially be in the form of a letter or some sort of written correspondence, just because they can't publicly contact and face-to-face everyone. So it is at that stage a paper, but should they get interest, should they get contact, then obviously they would go out and formally meet and review the property and make decisions.
Councillor McLaren, and then I'll come. Councillor Osborne wanted to add to that. Which way should we do this? Councillor Osborne answer the first question, and Mary can come back with the second one. Does that work? Go for it then, Jan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I do actually represent the Council on the Shared Revenue Partnership, and we get quarterly reports from them on the work that's being done on empty properties, and they're very productive in that, and they do a lot of work. They do act a lot on intelligence as well as their own piece of work. But so there's 2 sides to it. You've got the housing team doing their piece of work and the Shared Revenue Partnership as well.
Councillor McLaren.
yes, I was just going to go back to if I've got quite a lot of money as a property owner. Is this a threat to me to occupy the property, or the access of the council? Does it have a lot of power to make changes?
So first and foremost, I think our approach would always be one to try and support the owner to return the property to use. There will be always a number of extenuating circumstances as to why that property is empty and empty for a period of time. Some of the impact is as a result of becoming incidental owners, so through bereavement or through those type of means. A person becomes the owner of a house but doesn't know necessarily what to do with it. So that's an example. The examples with private sector housing is initially loans and grants to support it being returned into use. Obviously, there is always the opportunity that we could take enforcement action, but that would always be a very last resort. And then through the work of the Housing Solutions team more widely, obviously trying to fix that housing crisis in terms of the number of people on our housing register and in homelessness. We do look to offer support to those landlords to perhaps support them in terms of finding a tenant for those properties. And we've got work coming forward in the early part of this year, which we'll be launching in April, which will go further to support landlords in terms of attracting tenants and maintaining them.
Councillor McLaren.
Do you as a department publish the list of reasons or give the percentage of unoccupied properties, the reasons why they're unoccupied? Is that something that you produce?
I think we're straying slightly off the subject of the budget
no, I
here,
just
Councillor
wondered
McLaren.
if it...
Perhaps we can deal with that in another item, because I believe we've got an item actually on occupancy of housing,
thank you.
and we will be coming back to that, but I'd like to keep this to a budget discussion. I think you're quite right to raise it, because effectively it's worth reiterating that this proposed change is that we're reducing the period of time for which we offer this discount from 3 months to 28 days, effectively 1 month. So that's an important distinction to make. We're not removing it completely. The principle is still already established. All we're really arguing about is the time. Councillor Dawson.
Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering out of interest how this works with places like, and I don't really like to bring it up because there's a bit of a hornet's nest, but where you've got the situation in places like Angel Court and they're all in the budget, and that's been, you know, going on and on for 5 or 6 years. So are we again putting that into this year's budget, and it might not happen? And I just wonder how these figures have been, what's been happening in previous years, and how that's reflected in the finances here.
Is that categorised?
But there must be several like this across Babergh. I'm just choosing that one because this happens to be in my ward. But how are those figures reflected?
Is that? I don't think that's necessarily
Well,
categorised
it
as
is,
non-occupied, unfurnished building. I think that's.
Well, okay, not that. We could take. We've got a lot of buildings, haven't we, across that we own that aren't. I just what I'm trying to get to grips with is what you're doing with the figures with these unoccupied when there are plans for things to commence that actually don't start, and they're being put into the budget. That's my understanding, or is that wrong?
Let's establish whether we've got here. Have we got an unoccupied building, or have we got a separate category which refers, for example, to Angel Court? Can anybody help with that?
Well, okay, not so much that. Maybe you know, there are a lot of other buildings, I think, in Sudbury and Hadley, where, you know, across Babergh, where the figures are being put in and they're not actually occupied, and they have been vacant for long periods of time. So I'm just wondering what happened in the previous years and going forward, what's happening with the figures for these?
In terms of council tax, because obviously we're talking about council tax here and the reduction in the discount, where we have our own social housing, where that is unoccupied for a period of time, then it would be subject to the same discount. Obviously the housing team have been working very hard to get the void days and the void time down, so it is now within the 28 days that we are proposing.
But if you've got buildings that are sort of meant to be, you know, finished this year, and perhaps they're not, how is that reflected in the figures, or isn't it, going forward?
I don't think I quite understand the question, sorry.
Well, say for instance, I don't know, like, well, say an Angel Court, if that was meant to be finished in February, and you're expecting income to be generated or spent or whatever, and it isn't, are those figures in these figures here or not really?
That's Angel Court's a development site and it's not completed. It's not an unoccupied or unfurnished dwelling.
Yes, but there are others, wherever they are. Well, I'm trying to ascertain here, are these figures in here? And then if they're not, no. Okay.
I think, again, it's really difficult, because I think any time, and it's quite true, it always has been, any time we talk about the subject of housing, it can mean so many different things in different contexts. This context is the budget, and I don't think it necessarily means anything here. I did refer to the fact we will be looking at occupancy rates and other aspects of housing policy in scrutiny, much as the housing team do on a regular, well, almost a daily basis, I would imagine. Any other questions, members, or comments, or anything you want to cover in this section of the papers? Okay, Councillor Dawson, your microphone is still on. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Sorry.
That's all right. It always gets me. I think it's the one on the right. Okay, so we come now to there's some suggested recommendations for this paper. Perhaps it would be worth turning to those and seeing if those recommendations are ones you would wish to consider, or whether you would want to alter them, change them in any way, or add any further recommendations, or remove all of them. I don't know. Let's have a discussion. Recommendations, by the way, in the paper in front of you were the same ones that were given to Cabinet. We can make up any recommendations we wish ourselves. These are just guidelines as to what Cabinet had considered, and I believe at the last Cabinet these were all passed. Bear in mind this is a draft general budget, so we are still in the process of forming the budget, and the input Scrutiny gives goes back to Cabinet for them to consider whether we have added anything or whether we've made any changes and suggestions for the Cabinet to consider before it goes to Council. So, any thoughts? Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I would agree with the recommendations here on all three points. I don't think there's a fourth point, is there? No. And the reason for the decision on it is coming back to Cabinet anyway, and so I'd just like to compliment the finance team, Catherine and Melissa, and her team for a good report, and obviously, hopefully, if anything changes, they will come forward to budget. Thank you.
Are you proposing then that we endorse all three of those recommendations?
I do, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I can't see any reasons for us to scrutinise any further positions on this, because it will come back to Cabinet, and therefore we will be told about it, hopefully.
I have to confess, and I think we have looked at this, and we're going to look at this again, but I mean, I'm inclined to second the motion, and I'm doing so simply because, as Chair, I know I'm going to be looking at this again. I will make an observation or two, though, in doing so. Every year, the budget comes through, and every year we find ourselves almost up till the last minute scrabbling around for those last tens and twenties and sometimes hundreds of thousands, and very often it's been the case that they've only just turned up after the draft stage and only just before adoption of the budget. This year is the first time I can recall in the last 4 or 5 where that hasn't been the case, where we actually have a position that shows a surplus, and I have to confess it from figures given by Councillor Ward today, a surplus that looks as though it could even change a little bit upwards, because there are some movements in the figures already, and again, that's an interesting point. One of the principles, though, I think, and I would caution members, but this is just a general observation, I'm still seconding the motion, is that the pressures in the next 3 years are a lot more uncertain. But as I've pointed out previously, I think somewhere else, that we'd thought this year was going to be the tough year. At the moment, it looks like next year is going to be the tough year. Maybe next year we'll say something about the year following, I don't know. I'm happy to second that. Any other comments or questions or any discussion? Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I have no other anything to add to that, other than that, obviously in the next 3 years, hopefully you'll still be there.
Well, I mean, since there's not another election for this council for 2023, that covers us for 3 years anyway, so we'll just have to hope that I don't fall under a bus in the meantime. So then, we've got all the various points, recommendations been proposed and seconded.
Excuse me, Chair, before we vote, can I just make sure that we say that we could totally agree that it is the Overview and Scrutiny Committee endorse recommendation 3.1 to 3.3. Would you like to include and compliment the finance team on the work conducted for the budget or something?
Was included in the thing, and I would certainly happy to second that, because it is actually, I say, a simpler piece of work. Actually, I think it's also one that the general public might be able to understand rather better than would have been the case in the past. Councillor McLaren might have doubts about that, but believe me, it was a lot worse in the past, Mary. Okay, so can we take a show of hands on that proposal? Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Okay, thank you very much, members. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Here we go. And the paper is BOS 16.9, which is the draft housing revenue account, HRA budget, and once again the 4-year outlook. So once again, I ask Councillor Ward, as the Cabinet Member for Finance, to introduce the paper.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm pleased to introduce report BOS 19.6 for the 2020 to 2021 HRA budget and 4-year outlook. It covers both the HRA revenue account and the capital programme. We have a sound 30-year business plan, which has resulted in favourable positions for both revenue and capital for 2020 to 2021. We have been helped by the ending of the annual 1% rent reduction imposed by the Welfare Reform and Work Act 2016. The action now allows rents to be increased by CPI, which is currently 1.7%, plus 1% for 5 years from 2020 to 2021. The remaining 25 years of the business plan are based on an annual rent increase of CPI only. The business plan is attached to Appendix B and shows additional detail for years 1 to 10. Section 6.2 of the report shows the predicted movement in the reserves over the next 10 years. It shows a slight reduction from £12.7 million to £12.2 million. Section 6.3 shows the debt repayment profile for the next 30 years, with all debt being repaid by 2049 to 2050. A fundamental review of the housing service has been undertaken during 2019 to 20 to identify savings, efficiencies and income generation opportunities to achieve a sustainable business plan into the future. And the scope of this review is provided in section 7.1 of the report. We are continuing with our aspiration to increase our housing stock. New homes of all types provide us with new homes bonus and council tax, but additional council housing also delivers rental income and wider financial and social benefits. The table in section 10.1 of the report sets out the HRA budget for 2020 to 2021 based on the 2.7% rent increase and highlights the movement from the 2019 to 2020 budget. A surplus position of £298,000 is forecast, which is a significant improvement on last year, which showed a deficit of £193,000. And this has been achieved by reducing both revenue and capital budgets, provided in table 10.1, and we are proposing to transfer this surplus to the HRA reserves. Income and savings opportunities that have been made and are proposed for 2020 to 2021 are identified in section 8.2. We are proposing to increase sheltered housing charges by £2 per week to ensure recovery of the actual cost. It is proposed that utility charges are kept at the same level as the current year. Garage rents will remain at the current level. Income increases or savings continue to be reflected in the budget and will be monitored during the year. Next year, we'll see a focus on all contracts, those more than £50,000, to review the terms of each of these and to identify savings opportunities, as well as a decision on the long-term future of building services via a joint venture with Flagship Housing. A review of the HRA business plan will also be undertaken. Finally, I'd like to note that the right to buy sales were lower than those projected in the business plan. In 2018 to 19, Babergh sold 15 against an original projection of 27 sales. Moving on to the capital programme, section 5.4 of the report summarises the capital expenditure and financing for the next 4 years up to 2023 to 2024. And section 6.4 gives a graphical view of the expenditure. Paragraphs 11.1 to 11.3 and Appendix A provide more detail on this. Working with Iceni to identify development sites, we are aiming to build 229 affordable homes and 15 for shared ownership. We are anticipating a cumulative capital programme budget of just under £51.2 million, which includes £26.9 million for the new builds and acquisitions to be financed from a number of sources as shown in section 5.4 and the appendix, including £11.7 million further borrowing. No strategic priority reserves will be reduced to finance this programme. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Ward. Are there any officer comments or any officer additions to make to that? Right then, members, over to you. We have a fairly short paper, but there's some quite significant stuff in there. Any questions? Oh, well, I'm going to have one. Because, I mean, I think one of the first things that sort of jumps out, of course, is the huge increase in capital spend for new build and acquisitions in the years 2021-2022. Since we have the Cabinet Member for Housing here as well, and as well as the finance team and the Assistant Director for Housing, it's probably as good a time as any to ask about how the rollout of this would take place. Yes, Councillor Gavin Fisk.
Thank you, Chair. So in relation to the capital programme, yes, Babergh are investing heavily in development of new homes, and we all know the justification and reasons for that. The schemes coming forward in the very near future are obviously schemes in Shotley, Angel Court, Bramtham, amongst others. We have been working with Iceni on that pipeline of activity to ensure that at any one time we have properties that we are or land that we are identifying for housing, that we're going through the planning process, design, and through to being on site. So I think over the next couple of years you can you'll continue to see that sort of progression in terms of at any one time us working diligently on building new homes at a site or sites, and those sites coming forward in the meantime as well. Some of the examples of that going on at the moment are the review of garage sites and possibly whether or not those sites are suitable for us to develop or for alternative uses. Self-build is an example of that. But it always comes back to the fact that land is of a need. Obviously, we have looked at and identified as many of our HRA opportunities as we can. So I think as we go forward, we'll be needing to identify land opportunities to then support that house building.
Councillor Dawson.
I wonder if I might just come back to you on this business with the garages, and we've talked about this for a long time, and what I've noticed recently, because we've had a lot of problems with this in Hadley, and you say you're having a review, and I talked to one of the team about this only last week, and they've said to me quite clearly that they're not reviewing it, because what I can't understand, I have to say, is we've say got 20 garages where there could be sites for more affordable housing. And certainly, unless you've got anything bigger than a Mini, none of these cars can get in these garages. It's really very, very clear. They're paying £800 or £700, I think, a month, £13.49, whatever, yeah, £700 a month, and they are used for storage. And you know, the team have said to me, your team have said quite clearly, they simply don't have enough time. So what is happening is people are parking in front, so not even using them. So why you say the team are actually looking at these sites, I don't believe that's actually the case.
Gavin?
So they've told me.
Okay. Thank you,
Councillor
Chair.
Dawson, your microphone's still on.
Sorry?
Thank you, Councillor Dawson, for the question, which I hope I can answer. So there is an ongoing piece of work involving the housing and our assets team to review sites, and we've actually traffic light all of our sites in terms of a red, amber and green. That's in relation to both supply and demand for the site, as well as potential future costs in terms of maintaining those garage sites and so on. There's actually a report coming to admin briefing in the next few weeks in relation to garages, and that will summarise some of the work that's been done. We have had staff vacancies, and that's been part of a restructure within the housing team, which has left some vacancy management to manage. But what we have been able to do is been able to let any site where we have demand, where we struggle is where we've got sites with empty garages and we've got no demand. And as we take that work forward, the briefing paper to admin talks about actually trying to take a different approach. So the weekly rent is about £11 or £12 per week, depending on whether you're a tenant or a non-tenant of Babergh District Council. And as such, actually, we may need to come back to Cabinet and ask ourselves the question, yes, there is a revenue generation opportunity here, or there has been. Actually, there is no demand for this area. House building may or may not be a suitable alternative, but maybe an alternative is to look at demolishing the garages and making those car parking spaces. So a whole range of different options being considered at the moment for all of those sites. So I can reassure you that that work is going on.
And are you considering compulsory purchase with a view which one could do for some of these, perhaps, where if they're more rural, to then use for housing, affordable housing?
Again, I think we're straying off the area of the budget, but by all means answer, Gavin.
Just very quickly, so one of the challenges that we have in Babergh are that we have, or decisions were historically made that we will let a garage with a property. It's termed compulsory let. That means that in terms of the rent that the tenant pays, the cost of the garage is already assumed. That is payable by HB as well. And so therefore, historic decisions were actually supportive of maintaining as much garage income as possible. The fact is, though, that as a result of compulsory let, as and when properties may be sold through the right to buy, the garage is sold at the same time. So we do have the challenge with some of our sites where actually there may be opportunities for redevelopment, but there would be a need to talk to garage owners about those decisions and how we move that forward. And where we have done that, we've been able to bring forward sites and offer an alternative parking provision to those owner occupiers, and those conversations are going on now in certain sites. I know.
Am I right in thinking there might be some legacy arrangements in place that would preclude doing some things in some circumstances because you've different legal arrangements and different agreements made in the past? Yeah. Okay, Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask a question? When the budget is set for the increase in rents and sheltered housing costs, looking at that, that's quite small, but for many people, that is quite a lot of money. This is not really about housing, but when you're setting the budget, do you look at the impact that might have on the population that we're actually serving and on the tenants? Is that sort of taken into consideration?
Councillor Ward, I think you've got an answer for that one, because I think that actually speaks to the increases. Councillor Osborne will speak on your behalf in that case. Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, John. Yeah, actually, I did challenge the proposed increase in the sheltered housing charges, because I was rather concerned about it. And when we looked into it, at the moment, prior to this proposed increase, the general needs accommodation is actually subsidising the sheltered housing to a cost of 58,000, which is quite a lot of money. By increasing it by the £2 per week, we then reduce that subsidy on general needs to 31,000. You will note that we didn't increase the charges last year in the 19-20 budget, and we also are not proposing to increase the utility charges. So yeah, it is a concern, but we have to balance it out on sheltered housing and on general needs, and that was the decision. But we did discuss it at length, so yes, it is looked at and discussed at length.
Gavin, you had a point there.
Thank you, Chair. And just to add to Jan's comments, Councillor Osborne's, it's a fact that rents have decreased year on year for the last 4 years. It's a fact that in terms of the HRA business plan, it's based on both 5-year projections and 30-year projections. So actually rents in 2020-21 will actually be less than they were back in 2015 as a monetary sum per week. Naturally, we have to look at what we need to provide the services. Don't need to remind members that the housing revenue account is ring-fenced, so any money generated coming in through rents or service charges is actually reinvested in the housing service, whether that be new homes or improvements to the existing stock. And I think as providing that we can give certainty that we are being as financially efficient in terms of being responsible for that income and managing it in the best way, then that's the reassurance I could give tenants that any increase is as a result of a need to improve their homes.
So just to summarise, that's the cumulative effect of the 1% cut that has been taking place the last few years, and that 1% has been year on year on year, every year. But now we're increasing by 2.7%, but we actually haven't recovered back the -1, and so on.
Yes, that's correct, Chair. And I'd go on to add that actually decisions that were made in terms of the 1% reduction, we've obviously managed and mitigated against. But as I said, housing revenue account business plan is predicated on a 5-year and 30-year business plan. Well, in that business plan, that it will be projecting rents, or it was back then, projecting rents probably increasing by 2, 3, 4% per year, per annum, year on year. So actually, if you were to look back, rents are far lower than they would have been predicted at this stage some 5 or 6 years ago.
One of the net effects of this budget, it's referred to in the recommendation 3.6, but obviously that's up to us, but is a budgeted surplus of £298,000, and that's to be transferred to the HRA reserves for this coming financial year. And I just wondered, how much significance does that amount, will it make a significant difference to the HRA reserves, or is it just a pinprick? Who wants that one? Gavin.
Thank you, Chair. So the report does detail reserve balances. I'm just trying to look for the detail as to which table that is in. Basically, reserves are approximately £12 million. And some of the conversations that I'll be having with portfolio holders for housing and cabinet in the not too distant future is how we maximise those reserves, and that could be reinvestment in new housing and purchasing land, or it could be on significant improvement programmes for our tenants that will see the benefit in terms of additional capital expenditure on their homes.
Thanks, that's exactly what I was driving at. That's just a very general thing, because I was looking at the graph C, capital programme, which obviously shows the capital spend over these years. And although capital maintenance is steadily increasing, as it should, I mean, we have to preserve the housing stock that we have, there is quite a lot of changes in new build and acquisitions, with that big peak in 2021 to 2022, which we've already commented upon, and 229 houses can only be welcome. But one wouldn't want to see it stop there. We wouldn't want that to be just a one-off, a blip. So I was hoping for some reassurance that we were considering further builds. Can we confirm that we are looking for some further builds? Councillor Osborne, as Cabinet Member for Housing, perhaps you could answer
Thank you,
that.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I can confirm that 100%. We will be looking for new builds.
Thanks. I think it's an important point to bring out. I think it's something that I've commented in the past, that English and Welsh councils stopped building council houses to a large extent 30 or 40 years ago, and literally hadn't done so for many, many years. And the figures, there's a BBC figure shown a couple of years or less than a year ago, which just showed the dramatic amount of changes in who builds what and who doesn't build very much at all, and a plummeting of the figures for council houses across the country. Councillor Ward.
That is true, but stockholding authorities, those that still remain as stockholding authorities across the country, whatever political persuasion, are now embarking on construction programmes. A lot of that, of course, has been encouraged by the fact that the cap on borrowing within HRAs has been removed, and that's going to be a great help over the years to come.
Thanks very much for pointing that out. It wasn't making a political point. I really genuinely was talking about this as a study. There was a series of articles, I don't know if many people had a chance to see it, on the housing situation in East Anglia, in the East Anglian, a whole week's articles on the general subject of who all the housing providers were and the pressures and issues facing each one of those in turn. If nobody's seen it, I'm trying to get hold of a collection of those articles. They are really very well done. Gavin, you had something to add?
Thank you, Chair. Just to add to that, graph B in the report, that projects the debt profile over the next 30 years. The dotted grey line is the former debt cap that, as a housing authority, we could not exceed prior to the removal of the debt cap. The green line shows you a prudential debt limit that we have set to maintain that we can afford any debt that we borrow, and obviously we'll be reviewing that in due course as well. But you can see that actually the removal of debt cap has allowed us to borrow more money to invest in new homes, and that's evident in that graph.
Is that dramatically affected by the rise in the public sector, the Public Works Board?
We have done a detailed review based on PWLB rates. It does affect the business plan over the 30 years by approximately £5 million, but that's over obviously 30
over
years.
30 years.
And obviously it depends on where we're looking for that borrowing in terms of short or long-term borrowing, and obviously any borrowing within the housing revenue account is part of the medium-term financial strategy that the council's
I mean, that particular section of graph B, I have to say, it is obvious that the area above the dotted line just shows the difference that the removal of the debt cap has made in terms of the potential of what could be done. So thank you for that. I just wanted to bring that point out because I think it's a very important one. And if you're talking about the HRA, it's probably the most important one. Councillor Ward.
Yeah, and in terms of whether the borrowing is long or short term, and to the extent we need to dip into the PWLB and the impact of the 1% increase, I think it's true to say, Catherine, isn't it, that the new government municipal bonds, which they're recently announcing, or have recently announced, will be at a lower interest rate than PWLB. Is that correct?
Yes, I think the first one is being issued to Lancashire, I think I heard last week. So that is finally up and running. The LGA have been trying to get this off the ground for about 3 or 4 years now. So that's another potential source of borrowing that we can look at going forward as well.
Right. Members, any other questions, any other comments before we move to, well, what recommendations we believe we should make? Now, there are 6 presented as suggestions here. Again, these are the same ones that were seen at Cabinet and were adopted by Cabinet. But again, we can change them. If we have any observations we make, I'm always very cautious for things like this. I mean, none of us are going to have worked out, well, let's change it to 2%. We won't have costed it out. So let's be careful with what we say. But there are 6 recommendations in front of us. They range from the HRA proposal itself to the increase in council house rents, the garage rents being kept the same, the sheltered housing service being increased to ensure. I add that just from what you were saying, Councillor Osborne, that in fact we'll still be subsidising the sheltered housing, just not to the same extent as before, cutting it maybe, what, 40% of that subsidy cost, something like that? We're still paying 60%, but the 40%, yeah, slight reduction. Okay, so that's about £100 a year, really, isn't it? You know, effectively. Yeah, £2 a week. It's £100 a year, more or less. And then the utility charges being kept at the same level. I mean, nobody's going to argue with 3.3 or 3.5, I would imagine. Any thoughts? Any proposals? Any recommendations? Members? Let's see if we can frame some recommendations. Councillor Osborne.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just 3.7, the right to buy receipts. I'm really a bit. I'd like just some clarification of how Babergh has stood with this and what is the position as we go forward on right to buy. Is there any knowledge of that?
Gavin, have you something on that one?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So that recommendation, in principle, is just that obviously the percentage of right to buy receipts that we can retain as the local authority are reinvested in new homes, rather than potentially holding on to those receipts and then having to give them back to central government with interest. I can reassure members that we are proactively spending right to buy receipts. We're also balancing right to buy receipts in terms of the investment in new homes with Homes England grant and evaluating when and where it's more appropriate to use right to buy receipts or grant that is available. But we have spent all of our receipts and projecting those being spent going forward, so we don't project that we'll need to be giving any receipts back anytime soon.
And to clarify, that's our right to buy receipts, not the totality. We only get a proportion. 30%. Yeah, which seems a bit strange when it's our housing stock, but there you go. So thank you for bringing up 3.7, and the final one I missed was 3.8, which is the revised HRA business plan in Appendix B, which it suggests that it be noted. Unless any one of us wants to pick that apart, I would suggest that one would be straightforward. So can we have a proposal, or whether we should take these recommendations as they're suggested, or whether we should alter them in any way? Councillor Osborne.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'd very much like to propose the recommendations as listed, and thank you for the clarification, Gavin, of 3.7. And once again, can I add my thanks to your housing team and all the other officers involved. I think you've done really really well to produce and go forward as you have done, judging by the contents of this report. Thank you.
Councillor McLaren.
I second that, Chairman.
Can I amend it with one suggestion to your resolution on 3.9, which would be that we...
3.9.
Or you'd be adding 3.9 that we congratulate... What was the expression we used last time?
I think that we have the overview and scrutiny committee... I can't remember, sorry, let me just find it again.
Because we added a thanks, but also... Was it a commendation or was it no commendation?
Compliment of the finance team on the work conducted.
Right, so something similar to that, but I'd also just like to add to that note with satisfaction the proposed capital expenditure, the proposed new builds of 229 houses. I think that is something that should be included in the recommendations, actively and promoted as such. As I say, I believe that's a good news story. There are some straightforward matter of business things. I'd be happy to vote for that. But we have a proposer and a seconder. Are you happy with that amendment, Councillor Osborne?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'm very much in favour of that amendment.
Can we draft it some way?
Obviously, it being in the financial situation.
Yeah, I mean, we can say that the overview and scrutiny note... Or you can say satisfaction.
Note with satisfaction the building of the houses,
yeah.
Something like that. Okay, that's I think, as much as we can say. All right, so any other proposals or any other changes that anybody wants to make? All right, so all those in favour of the proposal for those 9 recommendations. And that, again, is carried unanimously. I'd like to thank everybody here today. That's really useful to go through. We did go through the nitpicking stuff, but I think that's part of the job of scrutiny, is to take it to pieces and put it back together again. So thanks to all the officers for coming along today. Thanks to the Cabinet members for introducing and commenting. And we'll now move on to the next part of the scrutiny agenda. We had no information bulletin, which will be item 8. So the forthcoming decisions list is an item that I would like to go through, if members have got a moment to turn to that. Does anybody want a short break of any reason? We have a few little while to do so. Anybody want a 5-minute comfort break? No, we'll carry on then. So if you could turn to the forward plan, because of the time we lost, or rather the time spent in hiatus during the general election period, and then the gap caused by Christmas and New Year, I think we slightly lost track of where we were as our work plan. So I'd just like to run through that at the moment. At the moment, we have down for February BMBS and the proposed development of the building services case. So
Can I just sort of say, I'm slightly, it's slightly difficult for me. I've just only been put on this, and I can't really attend this in February. I'm doing surgery in London.
What I would say, is Councillor Dawson, is find a substitute from your group, but it can't be a cabinet member.
I've already asked them, don't worry, but I'm just sort of bringing it to your attention, because you're only going to have 2 people at the next meeting.
No, we obviously have 2 other members that what gave apologies, one of them anyway.
Well, as long as you're quite happy with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, substitutes would be encouraged, is all I'm saying. But I appreciate that with this being a fairly small committee now, and the council being reduced in size, we have this issue. For example, if a member of a very small group can't make a meeting and there's only one other member, to substitute.
But the other problem I'm also got is I can't really get here to 10 o'clock on a Monday.
Yeah,
so it's just awkward, this.
I understand. I mean, we've set our timings up at the start of the year, obviously. I think that's something for you to discuss with your group leader, if that's a problem. Well, yeah, absolutely. But it's not something we should probably discuss in meeting.
No, I just want to be clear about this, because would you mind if I turned up 20 minutes late, if I were in future, or is that a problem? Because otherwise I have to find someone else.
It only becomes a problem if there had been anything earlier on the agenda, like a declaration of an interest, which hasn't happened as yet. But you always have the option. You always have the option to bring up a declaration of interest at any point in a meeting. So from that point of view, it's no issue. We are not a decision-making body in that sense. So there is no. It's not like a planning meeting. Yeah. So from a governance point of view, I can't see any problem with that.
Obviously,
not to vote at that point. But I mean, it is, as you say, it's not a decision making. No. So it's okay for you to come in and comment. You're not taking a decision, so...
It's a judgment call, and of course what we're doing is we're applying our judgment and our scrutiny to an item. It's always assumed that everybody's seen the papers, so that they've got a pretty fair idea of what we've been discussing. And the initial part of any meeting or any item is, in fact, explaining what was already in the papers, or reiterating what was already in the papers. So, but we have to do that. We have to, because not everybody has access to the papers. This is broadcast on YouTube, and there's even a possibility somebody might watch this. You never can tell. But let's move on to that general point about this item, BMBS, and the proposed Development Building Services business case. The only reason I bring this up is that this will be the third time that we have looked at a business case for BMBS. And there's a new model being proposed, which I would really like to see as many people turning up for as possible, because this has become a recurrent issue and it's of considerable concern to the council. It affects all our tenants, it affects us reputationally, and it has been through some difficult times, to say the least, all right? It's an area that needs particular attention. Likewise, the other item on that February meeting, which will be chaired by Councillor Wellham as a joint meeting, is on planning enforcement, which, and I hope you've seen the new reports which we're receiving weekly, I hope, on planning enforcement cases. But this is going to be more of an in-depth study from the Chief Planning Officer of how enforcement is working and how it's going to work. And I think this addresses a concern I hear from members across the whole council, and of course across mid-Suffolk as well. But generally speaking, most people have different views about what planning enforcement means, and the paper is designed to address that. So Adrian and I have both had discussions with Phyllis Bell just to discuss how it's going to be brought forward. The next joint meeting after that brings us to customer access point activity. Again, there's a follow-up on how well the outreach centres, you know, the places in various sort of dots and Stowmarket, Sudbury, the pop-ups taking place in Shotley and at Hadley, how well they're going. That will be Councillor Parker, I think, presenting that. And then the Housing Delivery Test Action Plan, again, is a follow-up. We're going to be scrutinising an action plan that was previously discussed, and this is how we can measure and test if we are actually delivering the houses that we're supposed to. There will be a very interesting item on the 23rd of March, which I believe may attract some public interest. And this is something that has been asked for from the Sudbury direction for some time. I've had emails, I'm sure other members have, and it's on Bellevue House. This is a review of the plans for Bellevue House. It will not necessarily be involved in all aspects of things going on in Bellevue Park. As I understand it, this is specifically on Bellevue House. Should it change at any time, obviously we'll find out, but we'll let everybody know. Councillor Osborne, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, just the fact is that the park has got no relevance to anything to do with the house.
Agreed.
And there's an engagement going forward, which I believe is the end of this month sometime. So, therefore, this is a well-planned item to scrutinise after those plans have already been engaged by local residents, etc. Yeah, and the proposals which will come forward from them.
I think we're all aware that there's considerable public interest in that, and there's also considerable public confusion, and a lot of separate items have become conflated into one case. And I think it's important that, if nothing else the scrutiny can do, is we can actually say, no, this is one thing, that's another, and perhaps even that's another, and that's our job, is to throw light onto a situation rather than making things darker. Sorry, Councillor Osborne.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. There's a number of items around Bellevue Park itself. The swimming pool area, which has got no relevance to the park at all, again, and also Hamilton Road, which again is another engagement of what the intentions are to appease that. But you're absolutely right.
It's one of those areas where you've got the local knowledge, I don't. I'd be quite honest about it, but that's one of the reasons why we have so many of us scrutinising it, and Councillor Dawson will probably know a little bit more than I do, because it's Hadley's closer to Sudbury. Use your microphone, Councillor Dawson, because we are.
I thought all the swimming, I thought it was all going to be on that side, isn't it? Is this just Bellevue, or is it the rest of it as well?
No, I just said that it's Bellevue
Literally.
House specifically is what we're looking at the plans, and I wanted to make that point quite firmly, that there are separate issues involved in separate pieces, some of which, as Adrian has pointed out, we will not be discussing, unless, of course, it gets changed.
Yeah.
I'm just going through the programme at the moment. Mary.
Could I suggest, because I know about Bellevue House, but I really don't know the ramifications around it.
Which is what the report will be
Can
there.
I suggest that we, as a group, meet with Councillor Osborne, and perhaps he could explain to us, or somebody explain to us from Sudbury, what the actually, because we just read this, and because I'm from this side of the district, I'm not familiar with the other arguments that are going on.
I don't think, believe me, there's no problem talking to any member from any area at any time. I mean, basically, there's no reason why individuals can't meet. We could include that if you wanted to. But, I mean, frankly, I think a briefing in a scrutiny committee means that all the information must be equally shared and open to all. I wouldn't want to think that anybody's being briefed in advance beyond what they could find out from other members. I mean, frankly, that's probably the best route.
Does that mean then the people who are against their view, should we not be listening to their view as well then?
It may be that we call those as witnesses, but we haven't decided that as yet.
That's
Effectively,
what
I'm trying to say is that this item is on the agenda, but it will be specifically about this item. The actual work programme, Councillor Osborne and I will be discussing in the chair's briefings, along with, well, because this is an exclusively Babergh issue, it will be a Babergh meeting rather than a joint meeting. That's the one for the 23rd of March.
So where would the witnesses come in then? Would you call them in from the other side?
That's what the chair's meetings are there to discuss, is to decide as to what we think will be relevant and who we would want to invite to act as witnesses to inform us, so that we actually can give proper due consideration and make balanced recommendations on that. So I'm drawing your attention to this because it's only the 23rd of March. It's 2 months away. So the sooner we start thinking about it, the better. Councillor McLaren.
I just feel the two other members that are not here are not from that part of the world either.
It's irrelevant where they're from.
No. But to give a detailed...
both sides.
That
would be
largely be the job of the scrutiny committee in scrutiny. There's nothing to stop anybody finding out anything they want to beforehand. But I'm not proposing to organise a formal briefing from one side or another. I think members have to take that responsibility onto themselves. Frankly, we have more than enough meetings on particular aspects, and you can hear whatever you know from one side or one group or another.
You have just mentioned witnesses, haven't you, Councillor?
We obviously try and keep a...
So therefore, witnesses can come for both sides. It might be helpful.
Obviously, we would be looking to do just that. I mean, that's fundamentally what we do. We do actually look for witnesses that can throw light onto a situation. And sometimes we actually find the witnesses learn something themselves. Sometimes we learn a lot more. We just see how it goes. But we keep an open mind. But we do realise that we're talking about one specific thing. And if somebody starts talking about something else, I'm quite clear as chair that I will say, I'm sorry, that's not what we're discussing here. So I'm drawing your attention to that right now. That joint meeting, the underspend for grants for bringing empty homes back into use is something that's been discussed and referred to peripherally today about empty houses. Well, there's a grant. It's being underspent. Let's see how we can look at getting it properly spent. One item I would like to draw everybody's attention to, this again is in April, and I'm thinking ahead here, is representatives on outside bodies. Now, last year we invited councillors to fill out a survey form returned to Henriette here, and some members actually did so, and we provided the beginnings of a database. This year, I am proposing that we will publicise it a great deal earlier, as in starting around now, and that that we send a message, I will send a message out to all members with the forms, and we'll start, if not this month, in February, so that we have a receipt of those forms in February and March, ready for April, because otherwise we don't have enough data to work on. And we'll stress it. Now, there are fewer members, and there are about the same number of outside groups, but it's not a difficult thing to fill out, but we just need people to do so, because a lot of members are working away and not telling anybody about it, and I'm not suggesting any members are on these groups and not going to anything. We just need to get the information so that we can assign, I suppose, some idea of what the value of each representation is. And the final one at the moment is the 18th of May, which is our sort of review of the year. Now, we generally scrutinise ourselves to some extent. Oh, you've got something to add, haven't you? There's a new item.
Yes. Just to let you know that we have been asked to add joint home and housing strategy to the meeting in May as well.
Would that be part of the corporate outputs stuff?
Possibly.
Okay. We'll be looking at a strategy as well at that meeting. Obviously, we have lots of strategies, but this is going to be a strategy on housing, not planning housing.
Sorry, Chair, it will be a review of the work conducted throughout 2019 and 2020 and lesson learnt, improvements and achievements.
Right, so basically we're not only looking at our own work in the past year, we'll be looking at the housing strategy work in the past year as well. And the reason I mention all this stuff is because there is one suggested item. Jan Osborne here has written to both chairs and suggested something that she thinks Scrutiny could usefully do, which we could add value to, which is of some importance to the Council. Do you want to speak on this, Jan?
Yeah, so our democratic relationship is like out in the community, and I think it's fair to say that although we've been here now for 2 years, and we are focusing on locality arrangements and place-based working, there's still some perceptions within the community that the council is still remote from our communities, and that's not just with our residents, but also within our town and parish councils, I think it's fair to say. So I've suggested that we have a look at really, what our levels of participation are, what we want them to be, what sorts of types of things we could do to improve that. And I think it would be a really good topic for overview and scrutiny to look at. I mean, there's lots of initiatives that we could go out to. There's things like, some of the things, we've done a little bit with our marketplace stuff around National Democracy Week, where we went out and had marketplace stalls. So we could build on that. We could look at things like youth councils, youth forums, where we build those relationships with schools. I know we had a webinar in here for Democracy Week, and the schools are quite keen to build that relationship, but there is some work about getting them engaged to do that. So it's all around that. And then there's, as I say, there's other things we could do. We could have a great debate. We could have run campaigns to become a councillor, even because even across the very grassroots level, the parish councils, they struggle to get councillors, and so it's about selling the message about what you do and how you can improve your local community. But it's things like toolkits to assist people. It's improving information, having public forums and better consultation events. Yeah. So we can look at all of that. There's a whole raft. I mean, even introducing a staff volunteering scheme where we as staff go out and help the local community. So there's lots of things we could do, and I think it's a really good subject. So.
And that's the point. I mean, it's from a point of view of democratic services, but it's also, I think during recent events there's been some perception that people think there's a democratic deficit, that there are shortages in democracy. And there are, unless we explain ourselves and we actually communicate and contact people better. And
but
so
I think
what we're going... Sorry, what you're...
Well, just what really concerns me, I think we're way off ball a bit with this, because it's all going to the schools, but certainly, you know, being in an urban, and I'm sure Adrian, Councillor Osborne has the same problem, it's the accessibility into Babergh. You know, we have no presence. When people are called, the access into for the public, and including myself, is just a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. And what
You
really
mean specifically getting to Ipswich?
No, I think if people have got issues with their council tax, their waste, their dust, absolutely anything, they can't get in and discuss it with people. And what really bothers me about this is we get these things that keep coming back, sort of saying, well, we've discussed it, and we don't really. And I think having a big conversation, my impression is that's not really what people want. They want to be able to access Babergh, which they can't. You know, we don't have a presence there. They can't do it through. You know, it's a nightmare going on a computer. I know myself, actually, if you want to, you know, you're trying to get through to an environment or whatever, you know, you think, oh, if you've got an issue, you're not quite sure where to go. And it's more the practical access. And I think if we can resolve that, I think you'll find, I just think going out to schools and having big debates
I think that's an example. What we're discussing here isn't the specific various questions and answers and things. What I'm trying to suggest is that this is an item we should consider, and that it's something.
Yeah, but we should be looking at how we consider it. And the actual issue is accessibility from the public.
As you see it, my point is this. I'm not actually saying we should discuss it here and now. What I'm saying is that
but I think that should be part of what's on the agenda.
Anything is going to be part of what's on the agenda. That's the point. Nothing is ruled out. Yeah. And this is what I'm getting to, is my proposal is this, that we include, for the course of the next few meetings, to explain the situation, Jan here has a officer support available from June. Now, we don't want to wait till June to discuss this. It's far too important. It's fairly clear that there are issues with some things. Some people don't have those issues. Some people do. What issues there are, what observations all councillors have made, is something that could be looked at on a regular basis. Now, scrutiny is a good place to start this process. What I'm suggesting is that into our work plan, over the course of the next few months, starting with probably the February meeting, could we accommodate? And I'm suggesting a regular recurring item on the agenda where we start raising what the questions are, not what the answers are, what the questions and what the issues are, and we carry it forward. In other words, we give Jan here a head start in producing the report that will eventually start the ball rolling on actually what we do. But what we do will depend very much on the input coming from here. And I'll add, I've also had discussions with Cabinet members to get their input and their thoughts on this, because I see no reason not to do that. And as far as I'm concerned, and as far as any of us should be concerned, this should be open to all members across the whole council. But we are there out in the parishes and in the towns, and if we don't know what people's concerns and worries are, what councillors are, nobody does. So this is the way to do it. It's an idea to work with democratic services to basically address a democratic deficit. I mean, whatever form it might take. But we've got to start it, and there must be a process, and I'm proposing that's how we approach it, with a regular, updated item, not necessarily coming to any conclusions, but just raising the questions, producing the data, the ideas, and then Jan has got something to work with. Because otherwise, it's going to be just what Jan thinks, or it's just going to be what I think, or it's just going to be what Councillor Dawson thinks, or whatever. If any one of us did that, well, that's all we'd end up with. What we want to do is get what everybody thinks, and then we know where we start. So that's the proposal, and I'll be discussing it further at the chairs' meetings, but I just wanted to run that by you and hope that you'd see the purpose behind it. Yeah? Yeah? It's just generally, if we don't do this, who's going to do it? There were some items identified for review, but they're not currently timetabled. I'd just like to update these. The Disabled Facilities Grant is actually already underway to a large extent. In fact, decisions have been made recently to increase the maximum disabled facilities grant from £5,000 to £7,500, and that was done by a delegated decision, and is just adopted. So it didn't get off to a great start. It's being publicised now, but it's no real purpose in our continuing to keep this on our untimetabled list, because it's largely been dealt with unless anything changes dramatically. The crime and disorder panel, which is down here as being for September, October 2020, we were delayed because of the general election and our own timetable and the inability, some of the witnesses couldn't make the original proposed time. It got put back to October or November, by which time the general election had intervened and everything popped into January. Now we've held our crime and disorder panel meeting, our annual review, statutory requirement for this year. That was only last month. No, it was this month. This month, good heavens, it all goes so quickly. Really it's not likely the situation is going to change dramatically in the year 2020. However, we would still be within the statutory period if we held the next review in 2021, as long as it's before the end of the council year. So the proposal would be to move that to February of 2021. Is that correct?
February or March.
February or March 2021, depending upon availability of the relevant witnesses. I also understand that by that time there will be a new chair of the Community Safety Partnership, the Western Suffolk Community Safety Partnership, which will probably give them time to get themselves into the job, so that'll be of use. Other items, the joint comments and complaints policy is a recurring item, which we're going to get an update on. It may be after that we don't need to look at it again if we think it is well enough in place, but we'll have to see what the report says. And there was one item, we're going to be looking at this, Adrian and myself and the other chairs, at the next chairs meeting, which is, what, in a couple of weeks' time?
3rd of February.
3rd of February, yeah, 3 weeks' time. No, 2 weeks' time. We'll be considering improving access to the private rented sector at that meeting and trying to work out where we could slot it in to. Now, it's a very difficult subject because the honest truth is the government are looking at legislation at this very minute and will continue to be looking at it for the next 6 months at least. So it's questionable whether there's it's a moot point whether we should be discussing something which could change overnight. So we'll have to look at that then. And that more or less covers everything that I've got on our work plan for this year. Is there anything else on the agenda there? No, it's just the Mid-Suffolk one, which is not really our issue. So at that point, I think we've completed everything on the agenda. Thanks very much for coming today. Sorry I talked so much. And see you at the next meeting in February, probably about a month from now, I think. Actually, I should know, it's the 20th of February. Joint meeting where we'll be looking at BMBS, Building Services Business Case, and Planning Enforcement. Thanks again.